Brilliant. She knew you only deserved this piece of trash. My brother, Edward, burst into laughter, his voice echoing through the opulent mahogany-paneled office. I sat there, stunned, the small brass key, a cold foreign object in my hand. The old wooden box sat before me on the polished conference table, looking so out of place next to the stacks of pristine legal documents. My name is Bethany Crow, and at 37 years old, I never thought I'd feel this kind of public humiliation. I had rushed here straight from a double shift at Denver General Hospital, still in my worn-out blue scrubs, my hair in a messy ponytail, with the weight of exhaustion heavy on my shoulders. Meanwhile, Edward looked like he'd just stepped out of a magazine, his tailored designer suit radiating a smug confidence, as if he already knew everything was his. This moment, the reading of our mother Margaret's will, should have been a solemn time to remember the woman who had raised us. Instead, it felt like my dignity was being publicly executed. Harrison Phillips, our family attorney, had just finished reading the initial will, which left me with nothing but this weathered wooden box, a box our mother had kept locked under her bed for as long as I could remember. Edward was set to inherit the vast majority of our family's $15 million estate, including the sprawling ranch house in Boulder, a portfolio of investment properties, and all the stocks and bonds that had been the foundation of our family's wealth for generations. He had everything. I had this box. I mean, look at her, Edward continued, gesturing at my hospital uniform with undisguised contempt. Still playing nurse at her age, living in that cramped apartment with her kid. Mother finally realized who the real success story is in this family. His words cut deep, but they weren't entirely a shock. Edward had always been the golden child, the one who charmed everyone with his smooth talk and expensive gifts. At 41, he lived in a luxury penthouse downtown, drove a brand new BMW, and worked in a vague business consulting role that seemed to involve more networking at fancy restaurants than actual work. He had spent years meticulously crafting the image of the perfect son, the one who would carry on the family legacy with a certain brand of style and sophistication. I looked down at the simple wooden box, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling. It felt like a cruel joke, sitting there among all the official legal documents. Harrison cleared his throat uncomfortably, clearly sensing the raw tension in the room. The afternoon sun, streaming through the tall office windows, cast long, dramatic shadows across the conference table, making the whole scene feel surreal, like a terrible dream I couldn't wake up from. What had our mother been thinking? To leave me this worthless old box while giving Edward everything else? I thought about everything I had sacrificed. All the nights I worked extra shifts to pay for nursing school. All the times I had visited her when Edward was too busy with his social calendar. The injustice of it all made my chest tighten with a painful mix of grief and disbelief. Growing up, things hadn't always been so strained between Edward and me. Before our father's sudden death from a heart attack, we were a typical family. Our mother, Margaret, worked as a school principal, and our father owned a small but successful construction company. We lived comfortably in a modest home in Aurora, Colorado. Not wealthy, but content. Edward was 4 years older than me, and back then, he was the protective older brother I looked up to. We'd spend summer afternoons riding our bikes through the neighborhood, and he'd help me with my math homework without a single complaint. He was a good brother, but everything changed after Dad died. Suddenly, our family was thrust into a world of unexpected wealth. Dad's construction company was bought out by a larger corporation for millions, and various insurance policies and investments left us with more money than we knew how to handle. Mother was completely overwhelmed, trying to manage the responsibilities of this new fortune while grieving the loss of her husband. And Edward? He seemed to transform overnight from a protective older brother into someone I barely recognized. He became obsessed with appearances and social status. At 18, he convinced Mother to buy him an expensive car, claiming it was necessary for his college image. He enrolled in a private university, completely changed his wardrobe, and started running with a crowd of wealthy kids who looked down on anyone who wasn't from old money. While I was still struggling through high school, dealing with my own grief and trying to help Mother manage her new responsibilities, Edward was learning how to manipulate social situations to his advantage. By the time I graduated and told Mother I wanted to become a nurse, Edward was openly dismissive. "Why waste time with some blue-collar job?" he had said during one particularly harsh family dinner. "We have money now, Bethany. You could do something important, something that matters." But nursing did matter to me. I had spent so many hours in the hospital with Dad before he died, watching the nurses who showed such genuine compassion and skill. I wanted to help people the way they had helped our family during our darkest time. Edward never understood that. He saw my career choice as a stain on our family's new status, an embarrassment that reflected poorly on him as he tried to establish himself in Denver's social circles. His disappointment reached new heights when I got pregnant at 25 with my daughter, Emma, and her father disappeared. "Great," he muttered when Mother told him the news. "Now she's going to be a single mother and a nurse. What will people think?" Mother had been incredibly supportive through it all, helping with Emma when she could, and never making me feel ashamed. But I noticed how Edward worked tirelessly to undermine my relationship with her. He would make subtle, insidious comments about my financial struggles, my long work hours, the small apartment Emma and I shared. He painted himself as the responsible son who was building something important, while portraying me as the daughter who was content with mediocrity. Sitting in that conference room now, I realized just how effective his campaign had been. Somehow he had convinced our mother that he, the man who had done little but spend money and cultivate a false image of success, deserved the lion's share of our family's wealth. I had been so busy just trying to survive and be a good mother that I hadn't seen the poison he was spreading. The months leading up to Mother's death had been particularly difficult for me, though I didn't realize at the time how much Edward was manipulating the situation behind the scenes. Mother had been diagnosed with lung cancer the previous spring, a devastating blow, especially since she had never smoked a day in her life. The doctor said it was likely environmental, possibly from years of exposure to the construction dust from Dad's old business. But the cause didn't matter as much as the reality that we were losing her. I immediately rearranged my work schedule to spend more time with her, picking up extra shifts on weekends to make up for the reduced hours during the week. Emma, now 12, would often come with me to visit her grandmother after school. We would sit in Mother's sunroom, playing cards and talking about everything and nothing. She seemed to cherish these quiet moments, and I thought I was doing the right thing by prioritizing our time together over the financial stress it was causing me. What I didn't know was that Edward was using my absence during his visits to plant insidious seeds of doubt about my motives. Harrison would later tell me that Edward had spent considerable effort portraying my increased attention as entirely self-serving. "She's only coming around more because she knows you're dying," he had apparently said on multiple occasions. "She's worried about the inheritance. She thinks if she plays the devoted daughter now, you'll forget about how distant she's been all these years." The cruel irony was that I had been distant, but not by choice. Working as a nurse, especially as a single mother, meant long hours and constant exhaustion. There were weeks when I barely saw Emma except to help her with homework and make sure she had clean clothes for school. Finding time to visit Mother regularly had always been a struggle, a source of profound guilt, but it seemed impossible to change without sacrificing my job security. Edward, on the other hand, had all the time in the world. His consulting work seemed to consist mainly of lunch meetings and networking events. He could drop by Mother's house on a whim, bearing expensive flowers and exotic teas, regaling her with stories of his business successes and social connections. He made sure she knew about every minor setback in my life: the month I was late on rent, the time Emma got a temporary suspension from school, the car repairs that forced me to ask Mother for a small loan. It was a subtle, psychological campaign. The worst part was discovering that during Mother's final weeks, when she was heavily medicated and often confused, Edward had apparently spent hours talking to her about the future of the family wealth. Harrison later mentioned that Edward had brought up concerns about my ability to manage money responsibly, given my struggles as a single mother. He had positioned himself as the stable, reliable choice to preserve the family legacy, all while subtly suggesting that leaving me a significant inheritance would only enable my irresponsible lifestyle. Sitting in that conference room, holding the key to a wooden box, while Edward gloated about inheriting millions, I felt the full weight of his manipulation crushing down on me. I had been so focused on loving our mother and being present in her final months that I hadn't realized she was being systematically turned against me. He had used my love and devotion against me. "Sorry, Bethany," Harrison said gently, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine sympathy. His weathered face showed the wisdom that comes from years of handling delicate family situations, and I could see in his eyes that he felt uncomfortable with the entire proceeding. He slid the small brass key across the polished conference table, and it made a tiny scraping sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the silent, tense room. I picked up the key with trembling fingers, feeling its surprising weight. It was an old key, probably from the 1972nd, based on its ornate head and simple shaft. Edward was practically bouncing in his leather chair with excitement, clearly enjoying every moment of my humiliation. His perfectly styled hair caught the afternoon light, and his expensive cologne filled the air with its sickeningly sweet scent. "Go ahead, open it," Edward urged, his voice dripping with mock encouragement. "Let's see what treasure Mother thought you deserved." He chuckled again, a sound that made my stomach churn. "Maybe it's some old family photos or her jewelry from the 1962nd. You know, sentimental stuff for the sentimental daughter." Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Edward, perhaps we should maintain some decorum during this difficult time," he said quietly, but Edward waved him off dismissively. "Oh, come on, Harrison. We're all family here. Besides, I'm sure Bethany is curious too. Aren't you, Beth?" He used my childhood nickname with such condescending familiarity that I wanted to scream. I mean, after all these years of wondering what was in Mother's mysterious locked box, now you finally get to find out. The wooden box sat before me, about the size of a shoebox but deeper. Made from what looked like oak or maple, its surface was worn smooth by decades of handling, and I could see scratches and small dents that told the story of its long existence. There was a simple brass lock mechanism on the front, tiny but sturdy. My hands shook as I inserted the key, and I had to try twice before it turned with a soft click. Edward leaned forward eagerly, his eyes bright with anticipation of whatever embarrassment awaited me inside. "This is better than Christmas morning," he said with genuine glee. "I wonder if she left you a note explaining why you deserved so little. Maybe some helpful advice about budgeting on a nurse's salary?" I lifted the lid slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The box was lined with faded blue velvet, and inside, rather than the photo albums or jewelry Edward had mockingly suggested, there was a manila envelope. It was thick, much thicker than I would have expected for a simple keepsake or memento. Across the front, in Mother's careful handwriting, were the words, "My true will, to be opened only by Bethany Crow." The room fell silent. Edward's laughter died in his throat as he read the words on the envelope. Harrison leaned forward, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "That's unusual," he murmured, reaching for his reading glasses. "I wasn't aware of any second document." "What does it say?" Edward demanded, his voice suddenly sharp with concern. "What kind of true will? Harrison, you're her lawyer. You should know about any other documents." Harrison looked genuinely puzzled. "Margaret never mentioned any additional paperwork to me. This is highly irregular." He gestured toward the envelope. "May I see that, Bethany?" My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the envelope steady. The paper felt heavy, substantial, like it contained much more than just a letter. Through the manila, I could feel what seemed like multiple documents, possibly even photographs. "My true will," I read aloud, my voice barely above a whisper, still trying to make sense of what was happening. Edward's confident demeanor was beginning to crack around the edges. "This is ridiculous," he said, but his voice had lost its earlier smugness. "There's no such thing as a true will. Harrison, tell her this doesn't mean anything. The real will is the one you just read." Harrison adjusted his glasses and leaned back in his leather chair, his expression troubled. "I have to admit, this is unprecedented in my 40 years of practice. Margaret never mentioned any secondary documents or alternate arrangements. However," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "if this envelope contains a properly witnessed and notarized will that predates the document I just read, it could potentially supersede the previous version." Edward's face had gone pale beneath his expensive tan. "That's impossible," he said firmly, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Mother would have told us if she was changing her will. She would have discussed it with Harrison." This is probably just some sentimental letter or old family documents. It doesn't mean anything legally. Actually, Harrison continued, his lawyer's mind clearly working through the possibilities. There have been cases where individuals have chosen to keep their true intentions private, especially in families where there might be concerns about undue influence or manipulation. He looked directly at Edward as he said this, and I saw my brother flinch slightly, his jaw tightening. I carefully opened the envelope, my fingers still trembling with nervous energy. Inside, there were indeed multiple documents, exactly as I had suspected. The first was a thick, legal document, clearly a will based on its format and official appearance. It was dated just 3 months ago, making it much more recent than the version Harrison had read. Below that were several photographs, and underneath everything was a sealed letter addressed to me personally. The date on this will is the 15th of October, I said, my voice growing stronger as I realized the implications. That's almost 2 months after the will you just read, Harrison. Edward stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward and hitting the wall with a sharp bang. Let me see that, he demanded, reaching across the table. This is some kind of mistake or fraud. Mother was heavily medicated in October. She wasn't thinking clearly. Harrison held up a hand to stop Edward's advance. Please, let's handle this properly. Bethany, may I examine the document? I handed him the will with hands that were no longer shaking. As he began to read, his eyebrows climbed higher and higher on his forehead. After several minutes of careful review, he looked up with an expression of pure amazement. This appears to be a legitimate legal document, he said slowly. It's properly formatted, notarized, and witnessed. According to this will, Margaret Crow leaves 80% of her estate to Bethany Crow and 20% to Edward Crow. He paused, letting the words sink in. Furthermore, there's a detailed explanation of her reasoning for this distribution. The blood drained completely from Edward's face. He stood frozen for a moment, then suddenly exploded into action. That's impossible, he shouted, grabbing the edge of the conference table. She promised me the majority. We discussed it dozens of times. She knew I was the responsible one, the one who would preserve the family wealth. Edward, please calm down, Harrison said firmly. Let me finish reading the supporting documents. But Edward was beyond calm. His carefully constructed facade of sophistication and control was crumbling before my eyes. This is a fake, he declared, his voice rising to a near scream. Someone forged this. Maybe Bethany did it herself. She had access to Mother's house. She could have planted this box. This whole thing is a setup. I finally found my voice. Edward, stop. Just stop. The words came out stronger than I felt inside. But seeing his panic gave me a new confidence. You know, Mother always kept that box locked. You've made jokes about it for years, wondering what was inside. This isn't a fake. Harrison continued reading, his expression growing more serious with each page. There are extensive notes here, detailing Margaret's observations over the past several years. It appears she documented numerous instances of what she perceived as manipulative behavior and financial pressure from Edward, while also noting Bethany's consistent care and sacrifice. Harrison cleared his throat and began reading. From Mother's letter, his voice taking on a formal, legal tone. I have spent the last several years carefully observing both of my children, and I have come to understand that my initial assessment of their characters was fundamentally flawed. I was influenced by Edward's charm and apparent success, but I failed to see the manipulation beneath his polished exterior. Edward slammed his hand on the conference table, making all the papers jump. This is insane, he shouted. She was dying, Harrison. She was on morphine, and who knows what other medications. She wasn't competent to make these kinds of decisions. Harrison held up a finger for silence and continued reading. Edward has spent the past 5 years pressuring me for advances on his inheritance, claiming various business opportunities that required immediate capital. When I refused, he would become angry and manipulative, suggesting that my unwillingness to support him showed a lack of faith in his abilities. He made it clear that he expected the majority of the estate and felt entitled to it based on his education and social connections. My jaw dropped as Harrison read these words. I had known Edward was materialistic and entitled, but I hadn't realized he had been actively pressuring Mother for money. No wonder she had seemed stressed and worried during her final months. I had attributed her anxiety to her illness, never imagining that her own son was adding financial pressure to her emotional burden. Meanwhile, Harrison continued, Bethany has never asked me for anything beyond small emergency loans, which she always repaid promptly. She works double shifts to support her daughter while still finding time to visit me regularly. When I was diagnosed with cancer, she immediately rearranged her entire schedule to spend more time with me, despite the financial hardship this caused her family. Edward's confident posture completely collapsed. He sank back into his chair, his face flushed with rage and humiliation. She turned her against me, he muttered, but the words lacked conviction. Bethany must have said something, poisoned her mind somehow. Harrison wasn't finished reading. I have included photographs of the gifts Edward brought me during my illness, all of which had price tags still attached, showing that he considered these visits a financial investment rather than expressions of love. I also have documentation of the 3 separate occasions when he asked me to revise my will to increase his share, claiming that Bethany's lifestyle choices made her unfit to handle substantial wealth. The photographs Harrison mentioned were indeed in the envelope, and as he spread them out on the conference table, I could see the evidence of Edward's calculated approach to caregiving: expensive flower arrangements with visible price tags, bottles of wine that still bore their store stickers, even gift cards that highlighted their denominations. Each image told the story of someone who thought love could be purchased and measured. The final reason for my decision, Harrison read, his voice growing quieter, is that I have observed Bethany's genuine grief over her father's death and her authentic care for me during my illness. Edward's visits always included requests for money or discussions about inheritance. Bethany's visits were simply about spending time together. One child sees me as a bank account. The other sees me as a mother. Edward stood up slowly, his movements mechanical and strange. His face had gone from red to white, and he was staring at the photographs spread across the table as if they were evidence of a crime he had meticulously planned but never thought would come to light. "This can't be happening," he whispered. "I planned everything so carefully. I was supposed to inherit the money. I need that money." The desperation in his voice was a sound I had never heard from my confident, manipulative brother. For the first time in 20 years, Edward's mask had completely slipped away. The transformation was immediate and devastating. His perfectly styled hair fell across his forehead as he bent forward, gripping the edge of the conference table like it was the only thing keeping him upright. The expensive suit that had made him look so successful just minutes ago now seemed like a costume he was wearing for a role he had lost. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "I've already made commitments based on this inheritance. I bought the penthouse, assuming I would have the money to pay for it. I've been living on credit for months, waiting for this day." Harrison folded the documents neatly, his professional demeanor never wavering despite the raw drama unfolding before him. "According to the legitimate will, the one your mother intended to be her final testament, you will inherit 20% of the estate, Edward. That's still approximately $3 million. Most people would consider that quite substantial." "$3 million!" Edward's voice rose to almost a shriek. "I was counting on $12 million. Do you know what I owe? The mortgage on the penthouse alone is $8,000 a month. The car payments, the credit cards, the country club membership I can't afford to cancel because of my business connections." He ran his hands through his hair, destroying his careful styling. "I built my entire lifestyle around getting that inheritance." I watched my brother's meltdown with a mixture of satisfaction and genuine shock. I had never seen him lose control like this. I had never realized how precarious his financial situation really was. All these years, I had envied his apparent success while struggling to make ends meet on a nurse's salary, never imagining that his wealth was largely an illusion built on borrowed money and future expectations. "Furthermore," Harrison continued calmly, "your mother included specific instructions that your 20% inheritance be placed in a trust with structured payments over 10 years, specifically to prevent you from squandering it impulsively." She was quite thorough in her planning. The words hit Edward like physical blows. A trust meant he couldn't access the full amount immediately. He couldn't use it to solve his pressing financial crisis. His face crumpled completely. For a moment, he looked like the frightened little boy I remembered from our childhood. The one who used to cry when Dad scolded him for breaking something. Edward's final desperate act came without warning. In a burst of rage that seemed to consume all his remaining composure, he drew back his fist and punched the mahogany-paneled wall behind him with tremendous force. The sound echoed through the quiet office like a gunshot, and I saw his knuckles split open immediately, blood beginning to drip onto Harrison's expensive carpet. "This is not happening," he screamed, cradling his injured hand against his chest. "I will contest this will. I'll prove she wasn't competent. I'll drag this through court for years if I have to." Harrison stood up slowly, his patience finally at its limit. "Edward, I need you to understand something very clearly. Your mother came to me 3 months ago, completely lucid and accompanied by 2 additional witnesses, specifically to ensure the validity of this document." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "She anticipated that you might challenge her decision, so she took extraordinary precautions to make the will legally unassailable." The lawyer walked over to his filing cabinet and retrieved another thick folder. "She also provided me with extensive documentation of her mental competence, including recent medical evaluations and cognitive assessments. Furthermore, she recorded a video statement explaining her reasoning, specifically addressing her concerns about your behavior and her confidence in Bethany's character." Edward's breathing became rapid and shallow, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool temperature in the office. His injured hand was leaving small drops of blood on his expensive suit jacket, creating dark stains that seemed symbolic of his entire situation. He was no longer the confident, polished man he had been when we walked in. He was a caricature of himself, a shattered image. "She knew," he whispered, the realization finally hitting him. "She knew exactly what I was doing, and she was planning this the whole time." He looked at me with something approaching hatred. "While you were playing the perfect daughter, she was setting me up to fail." I found my voice, surprised by how steady it sounded. "No, Edward. While I was being a loving daughter, you were proving exactly why she made the right choice." As we left the law office, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in years. Edward's carefully crafted world of illusion began to collapse almost immediately. The first domino to fall was his luxury penthouse. Within 3 months, he was forced to sell it at a significant loss when he couldn't maintain the mortgage payments. His BMW was repossessed, and his country club membership was revoked for non-payment of dues. His social circle, built on the shifting sands of perceived wealth, abandoned him when they learned about his financial struggles and his mother's detailed account of his manipulative behavior. His consulting business, which had relied heavily on networking and the appearance of success, crumbled as potential clients lost confidence in someone who couldn't manage his own finances. Edward's attempts to contest the will failed miserably. The court reviewed Margaret's extensive documentation of her mental competence and her detailed reasoning for the inheritance distribution, leaving him with no legal ground to stand on. What little of his reduced inheritance wasn't consumed by legal fees was all he had left. He was bitter, broke, and alone. As I established the Margaret Crow Foundation for Single Mothers in Nursing, using a portion of my inheritance to help women facing the same struggles I had overcome, I realized that my mother's final gift had been far more valuable than money alone. She had shown me that genuine love and sacrifice would always triumph over manipulation and entitlement. The foundation was a way to honor her legacy and create something truly meaningful from the chaos and pain of her final months. It gave me a purpose beyond just my own survival. I had spent so long simply trying to make it, to provide for Emma and myself, that I had forgotten what it felt like to thrive. Now, with the foundation, I was able to help others not just survive, but truly thrive. I was able to use the resources our mother had entrusted to me to help others in my profession build stable, fulfilling lives. This act of giving back was a profound experience, and it solidified the wisdom of my mother's final decision. It was a victory not for me alone, but for all the women who would benefit from her foresight. And, in a way, it was the ultimate justice. The legal documents and detailed accounts proved that my mother wasn't just sick. She was a woman with a plan, a final act of love and protection that had been carefully calculated. She knew Edward's behavior and chose to document it, not out of spite, but to ensure her true wishes were fulfilled. I didn't have to seek revenge on Edward. I just had to live authentically, embracing the life she had wanted for me, while watching him face the natural consequences of his own choices. In the end, my mother's final gift was a profound testament to her love and her character, a victory that transcended the financial distribution of her estate. She taught me that the greatest victory isn't about defeating your enemies, but about discovering that you never needed their approval to build a meaningful and fulfilling life. Her actions showed me that she had been watching, observing the quiet sacrifices I made and the transparent choices that defined my life, even when I thought no one was looking. The true justice wasn't in Edward's downfall, but in the validation of my own life's work and my dedication to the values she had instilled in me. Edward's carefully constructed world of illusion, built on greed and a desperate need for external validation, crumbled because it had no foundation of integrity. He was his own worst enemy, a victim of his own choices. I, on the other hand, was now free. Free from the burden of comparison, free from the guilt of not being the perfect child, and free to build a future for myself and my daughter, on a foundation of genuine worth. Our mother's legacy lives on, not in the millions of dollars that were passed down, but in the foundation that helps others, and in the quiet confidence I now possess. It is a confidence born from the knowledge that I was, in the end, her true success story.